I'm Matt Fitzgerald, endurance sports author, coach, and nutritionist, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Sanitarium PB and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. The aim of this show is to educate and inspire you towards the pursuit of your own physical best performance. We do this through interviews featuring some of the world's top physical performers and also some of the world's preeminent experts in their chosen fields. Each week, we'll aim to bring you the highs, the lows, and the learnings of the featured guests through a variety of episode editions. That includes interest editions, expert editions, coaches' corners, and featured performer episodes. And I'm excited to bring you today's episode 141, featuring return guest of the Physical Performance Show, author Matt Fitzgerald. In this interest edition, Pogo physiotherapist Lewis Craig caught up with best-selling author Matt Fitzgerald to explore the concept of 80-20 running. For those new to the Physical Performance Show, Matt first appeared on the Physical Performance Show back on episode 109, where both Lewis and myself spoke with Matt around his best-selling book, How Bad Do You Want It? Mastering the Psychology of Mind Over Muscle. By way of bio, Matt Fitzgerald is an acclaimed endurance sports and nutrition writer. He's the author of the best-selling Racing Weight and How Bad Do You Want It, as just mentioned. Matt is a regular columnist for magazines such as Competitor, Bicycling, Men's Health, Triathlete, Men's Journal, Outside, Runner's World, and Women's Health. Most recently, Matt co-authored his latest book in the stable called 80-20 Triathlon, which is a further exploration of the theme of the best-selling 80-20 running. In this conversation, Matt shares around the concept that if you want to run faster, and who doesn't, then why it's important to slow down. Through research analysis and then outputting it into a version that is reader-friendly in 80-20 running, Matt will explain why the secret to becoming a speedier runner is going slow most of the time. It's contradictory, but as Matt explains in today's conversation, it is a habit and a training principle that has withstood the ages and underpins the performance of the world's best runners today. Simply put, running too hard, Matt believes, too often is the single most common and detrimental mistake that runners make. So you're going to really enjoy this conversation that Lewis Craig, Pogo physiotherapist, had with best-selling author Matt Fitzgerald. Here it is.
Hello, Matt.
Hi.
Thanks for coming back on the podcast again. This time I haven't got Brad with me. It's just myself and you. And thanks again for doing the previous podcast. It was really well received. I'm so excited to do another one again today, mate.
All right. I'm excited too.
And for those of you who haven't heard of the previous episode with Matt, jump back over to episode 109 where we talked about Matt's book, How Bad Do You Want It? Today we're talking all things 80-20 running and Matt's recent book, 80-20 Triathlon. Matt, tell us a little bit about how you arrived at the need to write 80-20 running.
Yeah, so if you ask a bunch of coaches in the endurance sports domain, whether they're running coaches or cycling coaches or triathlon coaches, like what is the single most common mistake that athletes make in their training? Most of them will say, a plurality, if not a majority, will say training too much at moderate intensity. So basically like going too hard on their supposed easy days. I've believed that forever. But only more recently has science started to show that we're right. The coaches who feel that way are right, that the top echelon of endurance athletes across disciplines, so rowers, cross-country skiers, runners, everyone, they do about 80%, this is where 80-20 comes from, about 80% of their training at physiologically low intensity. But most recreational endurance athletes do at most 70% more. If we're talking runners, more likely only half of their training at low intensity. And, controlled studies indicate that what the pros do actually works best for, Joe and Jane jogger as well. So, there's just a huge need. I wanted to write a book that addressed the single biggest mistake that endurance athletes make.
And it does a great job of highlighting why we need the 80-20 rule. And I'd love to jump into some of that evidence a little bit later as we go. But I feel like maybe first we better just define what we mean by 80-20 and what constitutes low intensity, moderate and high intensity for the listener.
Yeah, so that's a crucial thing to define. It's worth mentioning that this 80-20 rule, there's a different 80-20 rule that business people talk about, but the endurance one comes from the research of a gentleman named Stephen Seiler. He's an American, but he's based in Norway, married to a Norwegian woman, and he does his research there. His studies indicate that there's a crucial threshold. Most endurance athletes, runners, they've heard spikes. So if you start off at a very low intensity of running and sort of speed up a little and speed up a little more, at a certain point, you might not even notice it because it's at a fairly low to low intensity. Your breathing rate will go from a gradual increase to an abrupt increase, and that's the ventilatory threshold. If you jump across that threshold, even by a little bit, your muscles are demanding more output from your brain. Your brain is what drives your muscles. In order to get past that threshold, your brain has to start activating what are known as fast twitch or type 2 muscle fibers. So it's like flipping a switch, like either you're below it or above it. And if you're above it, it's fine. Your brain can do that. Your muscles can handle it. But the exercise becomes a lot more stressful to your autonomic nervous system. And that means you need more time to recover from that intensity. And so it matters a lot whether you're just above or just below that threshold. And that's why, really, when we're talking about low intensity, you need to be below that threshold, which in the typical trained athlete, not necessarily an elite athlete, but someone who trains, falls somewhere around 78% of their maximum heart rate. So it's not a walk, for most of us, but it's not a sprint either. It's right what it suggests. It's the borderline between low and moderate intensity.
Yeah, perfect. So that's where we want to be spending that 80% of our training at, that below that 78% of heart rate max. And you mentioned one of the most common fundamental error that a lot of runners make is doing too much of their training above that or at moderate intensity. And in the book, you outline some of the reasons why many runners fall into that trap and not realize that they're even jumping up into that moderate intensity. Can you talk a little bit about intensity blindness and why some runners fall into that trap?
Yeah, what's really interesting is there have been a bunch of studies done where researchers will just, they'll take a group of people, they might be college students, they might be runners or whatever, and they say, here, just jump on this treadmill and run for 30 minutes. Like, you choose the pace. Or jump on this exercise bike and pedal for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever. You choose the intensity. It's all up to you, whatever's natural. Almost universally, when people are given the freedom to choose their own pace, they choose an effort level that is slightly above the ventilatory threshold. Because physiologists, they initially wondered, well, there must be some, it must be efficient. There must be some physiological reason people choose that intensity. But that turns out to, long story short, not to be the case, that people are really just doing it by feel. They're choosing an effort level that feels moderate to them. My theory is that the reason people do that is they're sort of making a compromise between two natural instincts. When you're given a task like that, perform, one side of you just wants to get it over with. The other side of you doesn't want to suffer. The part of you that wants to get it over with wants to go fast. The part of you that doesn't want to suffer wants to go slow. So when you compromise between those instincts, what do you end up doing? And I think there are other reasons that people get stuck in what I call the moderate intensity rut, but I really think that is the main one.
We so easily get into that trap, even as experience goes on. So it's always an important reminder to keep it easy. And you arrived at some of the evidence for this. You mentioned it a little bit earlier on, some of the evidence for why that low intensity is so important, back off the work of Stephen Seiler. And it's not just his study, but it's also basically the natural progression of the elites over the years that have kind of self-selected that sort of training as well, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Can you talk a bit about like the role of Arthur Lydiard and the Boston Track Club and how that kind of filtered into this sort of methodology?
Yeah, so in the endurance space and in so much of fitness, health, and wellness, we look to science. We want science to give us the answers to everything, but there's really a lot to be said for real world trial and error when it comes to finding the optimal solution to particular problems, especially when the problem is as simple as who can run the fastest marathon, who can run the fastest mile, that type of thing. Science, don't get me wrong, I'm pro science, but the real world is messy. And often there's no shortcut to just duking it out on the race course and trying different methods and seeing which ones work best. And when you take a sport like running, the modern form of distance running has existed since the mid to late 19th century. So we've had generations of athletes competing with high stakes, with a lot at stake, Olympic medals and prize money and shoe contracts and all that. So what you've had is, if you go back through the history of look at the training methods that people use to try to win medals and prize money. At first, as you would expect in the early days, they were all over the map, because nobody had a clue. How do you train? We take certain things for granted, like, resting before you race. Runners didn't always do that. Like even champion runners would do a really hard workout the day before a race because someone actually had to figure that out. Like it wasn't necessarily common sense. So that, when I wrote this book, that's what I did. I went through the history, and it's not just running, it's, other endurance sports as well. But what you find is, obviously if something works better, it will tend to produce better results. And, talent has a role, but that tends to even itself out over time when you run the experiment for a while. And, and so there's a copycatting. It's very similar to evolution in the natural world when, survival of the fittest. If you have some genetic mutation that gives you an advantage, you'll have more offspring, and then those offspring will pass on that trait and so on until eventually every member of your species has that trait. Same deal in endurance training. Like, Arthur Lydiard was the first guy in, the 1950s, a legendary New Zealand running coach who realized, like if you run a lot, but you do most of that running at a nice, comfortable, easy pace, and then sort of choose your moments to go to the well, that seems to work really well. And in the 1960 Olympics in Rome, tiny New Zealand produced 2 gold medalists and a bronze medalist in running. Or it might have been 1 gold medalist and 2 bronze medalists. I forget. I haven't read my own book in a while. But, and then so, the whole copycatting thing kicked in. And this happened, again, not just in running. But, so, in 1960, what Lydiard was doing was revolutionary. It was crazy. It was beyond the pale. it was out there. But within a generation, half a generation, in fact, before even the next Olympics, pretty much, it had spread because the stakes were high. People want to do what works. And then, so you get onto the Boston Track Club in the 1970s, Bill Rogers and that whole gang, training by that method, conquering the world. And then, the Kenyans, people always want to think like, oh, the Kenyan runners are great because they're genetically advantaged, but they actually sucked at running until they got on board with the Lydiard method. You know what I mean? No matter how talented you are, you can't really succeed at the highest level unless you train the best possible way.
Yeah, and so the evolution of 80-20 running's kind of A, been established in science, and B, kind of being picked up throughout the elites as we notice that it yields better performance results. And there's numerous reasons why it gets those results. Some of it based off the low intensity and some of it based off the high intensity. So how does the low intensity help, how does that aerobic base really help our runners?
Yeah, so, obviously there are people out there who are really big fans of high intensity, right? There are some people in the endurance space who say, intervals are the thing. But even they would admit that you can't do all high intensity, like only high intensity. I think so. Everyone agrees that like you need to do some low, some moderate, and some high. And the only question is like, how much of each, what's the balance? What some of the studies, that make these comparisons tend to disguise is, well, they can be a little bit misleading because when you have a study that compares high intensity to low intensity, like only at very low volumes of training, high intensity is going to look great because the thing about high intensity is that a little bit goes a long way. You don't have to do much to get some benefit, but a lot of high intensity, there's that expression, speed kills, right? So, you get a lot of benefit from a little high intensity, but the diminishing returns kick in really quick. And if you do, a lot more than a little bit, it's actually detrimental. You start to become overtrained. Low intensity is the opposite story. And we'll sort of just wash over moderate for now. Low intensity, if you do a little bit, you don't get much from it. But guess what? If you do a little bit more, you get a little bit more, and you're still not overtrained because it's so gentle on the body, you can handle it. And if you do a little bit more, you get a little more benefit. The reason that 80-20 is the best balance is apples to apples, high intensity actually is better. But if you want to get the most benefit from a combination of low, moderate, and high, it actually is going to be heavily weighted toward low intensity because you can just handle and benefit from so much of it. So, you want what I call the maximally beneficial dose of each intensity. And the maximally beneficial dose of high intensity is pretty small. And the maximally beneficial dose of low intensity is pretty darn high.
Yeah, perfect. So we can actually handle that higher volume of low stress easier than that high volume of high stress. And it makes a lot of sense. And anecdotally in the clinic, we'll tend to see less runners that are doing that sort of approach and more runners that are stuck in that moderate intensity rut that you speak about and just running most of their runs at a same sort of moderate intensity. So we know that, that 80-20 principle can be really beneficial to runners, and not just runners, but triathletes, cyclists, swimmers as well. But if we're talking specifically for runners for the moment, how does someone start the 80-20 sort of approach? How would they kick that off?
Yeah, it's funny because what I'm really, asking people to do is slow down.
Yeah.
And that sounds easy, but it's actually harder than it sounds because what you're already doing is so habitual that breaking out of it requires some intentionality. Like you can't just do it. You can't just do it with good intentions. Like you have to be sort of programmatic about the whole thing. I like to have, if we're talking about the typical recreational runner who's like 50% of the time at moderate intensity without even knowing it. I I like to have them sort of like rip the Band-Aid off, so to speak, by just taking a week to, leave the heart rate monitor at home, leave the GPS watch at home, and just do what I call a week of slow, where they go out and each day or each time they run, slow down from what their habitual pace is until they reach a point where they just feel totally comfortable. Like, dial back to like an I could do this forever sort of pace, and just try to find a home there. I've seen it happen a million times. It's harder than you think if you're one of these moderate intensity rut people, because your instinct is to, as soon as your thoughts wander, you want to speed up. Your legs will just carry you, where your mind doesn't want to go. But the idea is just to sort of to get a feel for what low intensity actually feels like, which you're simply not accustomed to. I liken the moderate intensity rut to be it's similar to being chronically slightly underslept. If you need 8 hours of sleep a night and you get 7 hours and 15 minutes a night, you can function. You might not even notice you need more sleep. Only when you actually get that extra 45 minutes consistently every night do you start to feel like $1,000,000. And that's what this first step. It's not something everyone has to do, but I do encourage it. Just try this week of slow. You got to commit. It's like 7 days. I'm going to just put the brakes on myself. And it feels so nice, when you run at a legitimately low intensity. And then, you still feel so fresh the next time it's time to run. And then the next step is to actually figure out what low intensity is for you, right? Because it's important to calibrate your subjective sense of what low intensity is, but ultimately you need to know either by heart rate or pace or even running power. They have that now. You need to know what that dividing line is for you, because that makes it a hell of a lot easier to monitor and control. 80-20 is math, right? So you got to do a little bit of math, just some testing and some monitoring, so that you know what your zones are, because you are not the same as every other runner, and also your zones will change as you get fitter. So after that week of slow, you need to do a little bit of testing to find your zones, and then ongoing planning and monitoring to make sure you're actually obeying the 80-20 rule.
Yeah, perfect, Matt. I think you've just highlighted the need for a lot of us not only to slow down for a week, but potentially get a bit more sleep. I think a few people would have just gone, I think I need a bit more sleep now. So after that slow week, we want to make sure that we do a bit of testing, find out exactly where our zones sit, so that we actually end up doing most of our low intensity work in the true zone that corresponds to us. Now, once we kind of get into that low intensity, you do mention that there is a little bit of fine print, and that the 80-20 rule is flexible as we might all expect. What is a little bit about the fine print that listeners need to know for 80-20?
Yeah, well, I'll say two things in that regard. One is the 80-20 rule of endurance training is not the only rule of endurance training. So, there are other principles, because if you came in without any experience or any knowledge about running, and I was talking about this 80-20 rule, it might be very natural to think, okay, every time I run, I need to do 80% of that run at low intensity and the other 20% at moderate to high intensity. That's actually not the case, right? It is a best practice to sort of bunch your higher intensity work on, couple of days per week, and then do other runs that are all low intensity. So that's just one example of other best practices. The 80-20 rule is just one of them. But I think what you mean to get at is that the 80-20 rule doesn't necessarily apply all the time. Here's what I'll say. If your goal is to maximize your endurance fitness, you should do 80% of your training at low intensity, 20% at moderate to high. But your goal, even as a competitive racer at all times, is not to maximize your fitness. So you need to sort of break up the year and seasons within the year into phases. And so when you are trying to maximize your fitness for a race, yes, you need to be on board with 80-20. But prior to that, when you're just sort of building a base, sort of getting ready to go after maximum fitness, and you're more concerned about, well, I just took 2 weeks off and I'm just trying to like get my mileage, get my running legs back. Well, that might be a time to do something closer to 95-5, where because when you're increasing the amount of running you do, or you're increasing the intensity of running you do, both of those things are stressful. Mm-hmm. So it's doubly stressful to do both at the same time. So it makes sense, just you have to have a clear priority to sort of separate them. And so in base training, generally, it's okay to do almost everything slow. You've run 20 miles this week. You want to run 25 next week. Well, don't add a bunch more intensity on top of that challenge of increasing your miles. But once you've got your mileage up to sort of where you want to be, then you can sort of flip to that 80-20 thing. And then I'll also add that just when you in the last week or two before a race, when you're quote unquote tapering, the research indicates that you get the best results. You get the best combination of resting up and sharpening for a race when you sort of pretty drastically decrease the volume of your training, but still keep some intensity in there. So counterintuitively, in the last week or two before an important race, you might actually want to do more than 20% of your training at higher intensities, but the total amount of your training you're doing is a lot lower, so that you're still, freshening up those legs for competition.
Yes. So there's different times where we will look to include more or less low intensity or more or less high intensity. That building sort of phase where we're just getting back on our feet, you can see the role of that increased volume of low intensity, and then as you speak about that tapering phase where we still want that high intensity sort of race speed and maybe dropping off some of that volume so we're freshest for the race. In sort of that same lines of that some sort of fine print, we're talking about the things that coaches end up doing for a lot of us and for a lot of triathletes and runners. We start to talk about a few different principles and how to organise sort of your training. I think one of the important things you started to allude to is how to plan in hard sessions and easy sessions, and how to sort of divvy them up over the week or the training cycle. Is there any way that you sort of prefer athletes to do it?
Yeah. Smart training occurs in cycles. And again, this is one of those things where if you know nothing, if you're brand new, you might not, I did this myself as a young athlete. You think, oh, I can get better every day, forever. So, if I ran 4 miles today, I'll run 5 tomorrow a little faster, and then 6 the next day a little faster. And then, in 10 years, I'll be running 200 miles, at a full sprint. It doesn't work that way. So, the biggest cycle is, what's called a macro cycle, which usually, 12 to 24 weeks, where you start the process of getting fitter and you're aiming toward an important event. And then you build and build and build. You quote unquote peak for that event. You do the event, and then you need to rest. You actually need to intentionally give away some fitness. This is something that I see it again and again and again with less experienced athletes. They work so hard to build fitness, and whether the race goes well or poorly, they'll come to me and say, "Coach, I want to keep the momentum going." It's what's next? And I tell them, do nothing for a week. And they're like, but I've worked so hard to get this fit, but that's the way the human body is. You can't just keep, building and pushing forever. So that's the big cycle. Within that, you need smaller cycles of various lengths. The next smallest is like a Mezzo Cycle or a step cycle, which is sort of a build or a build rest cycle. So 3 to 4 weeks where this week you train hard, next week you train a little harder, and the week after that you actually sort of dial back and let your body consolidate its gains. Because the adaptation, actually the way your body changes to become fitter doesn't happen while you're running. It happens while you're resting after running. So those step cycles, Mezzo cycles, are really important as well, where you're not actually training more every single week, but only most weeks. And then the micro cycles are usually because most of us, we have jobs or we're students, and so we operate on 7-day weeks. There's no, I guess 7-day weeks come from the Bible, but I mean, like, there are pro athletes who aren't stuck to that, and they'll do 9 or 10-day weeks because it makes more sense. Most of us are pretty much stuck with 7-day weeks. So that's a cycle where you want to just apportion hard work and rest in a sensible way. And again, you don't have to figure this out for yourself because the sport has been around for generations. Generally, the quote unquote hard easy rule is the way to go, where you don't do 2 hard runs on consecutive days ever. And hard could be either fast or exceptionally long. So you might have 2 or 3 hard days per week, whether fast or long, and separate those either by easy days or rest days, depending on your experience and ambition level.
Yeah, perfect. I love the rest comment, Matt. I think we can all afford an extra rest day here and there, or an extra easy day here and there, and a lot of runners aren't great at listening to their body and acknowledging the need for rest and the importance for rest for optimizing performance in those other hard workouts as well. And when we're talking those hard sessions, I think a lot of runners that I talk to about their training plans, when we talk about, look, you need to do more easy stuff, when they approach like a longer race, like a half marathon and a marathon, they often wonder where they can get that race pace or that moderate intensity in without drastically dropping back to like a 50% moderate sort of volume. How do you recommend people approach that timing?
Pacing is it's really what the sport is all about, right? Like, the difference between a sprint and an endurance race is that in a sprint, you don't have to pace yourself. You go as fast as you can from start to finish. But in a longer race, you have to hold yourself back, and the question is how much, because the goal is the same as it is for a sprinter. You want to get to the finish line, even if it's 42 kilometers away, in the least amount of time possible. But especially if you're inexperienced, it's very difficult to know, well, 1K into a 42K race, like, how fast should I be running? Like, definitely not sprinting, I know that, but how much am I supposed to be holding back? Getting a sense of what your race pace is and sort of practicing it is essential. But, there are people, and I encounter these athletes who think, oh, I need to do that every day or very often. Like, no, you don't really. You need to get fit. Actual race pace training can be just a little bit of seasoning on top of the overall recipe of your endurance training, because every run you do gives you some information about your ability level if you're paying attention. So the actual intentional race pace practice can be fairly minimal, and obviously it's easier if you're experienced, but generally what I recommend, let's just say, you're training for a marathon. That's a long race, right? So your race pace is not all that fast, even if you're a faster runner. And so I think, your race pace training should come in the context of longer runs for the most part. If you're starting off and even covering that distance is out of your league at the moment, first you need to focus on building the endurance so that you can run that distance. And so maybe, the first half of the training process is focused on that, like just being able to go the distance. And once you've got that piece in place, then you can focus on doing faster, longer runs, or putting faster segments in your longer runs. And, there's a little guesswork involved. You might, halfway through the training process for a marathon, you might have a sense, okay, here's what I think my marathon pace might be at that point. And then you do some you put some tempo segments within a longer run at that pace and sort of try it out, see how it feels. And then there's another progression from there. First, you were worried about building distance. Now you're worried about like honing that pace and being able to be comfortable doing longer and longer efforts at that desired pace. And that's sort of how you do it.
You're listening to Matt Fitzgerald, best-selling author, sharing around the training principle of 80-20 running. Support for today's show comes from Sanitarium PB. Looking to achieve your personal best? Sanitarium PB can help. This refreshing drink contains 32 grams of protein per serve to help with muscle recovery when included as part of a balanced diet. Sanitarium PB is made with a balanced blend of milk and plant proteins, all your essential amino acids, and contains no artificial sweeteners. Find Sanitarium PB in delicious chocolate or vanilla flavors at your local petrol station. Be your personal best, recover and refuel with Sanitarium PB. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through Pogo Physio's doors to get back to their physical best, complete rehabilitation, and in doing so, cross your physio finish line. We do this through traditional session-to-session appointments and also our unique and award-winning fixed-fee rehabilitation services, including our very popular monthly wellness booster packs, which start from a low $195 per month and include physiotherapy, remedial massage therapy, active rehabilitation, including clinical Pilates, and use of state-of-the-art equipment such as the Alta-G anti-gravity treadmill and Normatec recovery boots. To find out more about Pogo Physio's services or to schedule your 1-hour initial appointment, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back with Lewis Craig and Matt Fitzgerald exploring around this concept of 80-20 running.
For those that are maybe looking to include something else in their training, you speak about cross training, and for people who maybe don't want to do an extra easy run, or they're looking to offload their knees, their hips a little bit on those easy days. What are your recommendations around some cross training for athletes and recreational runners?
Yeah, so I grew up as a runner, but I got into triathlons in my late 20s, and also I'm a very injury-prone runner. And for those two reasons, by my triathlon experience and my injury-prone nature, I've become a big believer in the value of cross training for runners. If you're one of those people who just is really durable and never breaks down, no matter how many mistakes you make, you could do the stupidest thing in the world. It's like start training for a marathon with a 20-mile run. If you can get away with that, God love you. But there are a lot of runners who they're ambitious. They want to achieve high goals, but they're not the Dean Karnazes type that can just do whatever and get away with it. And for those people, it's nice to know that cross training allows you to have it both ways. Like, as I say in my book, you can train more without running more. Let's be real, like nothing will benefit your running more than running. But, cycling, elliptical running, things like that, they're a lot better than nothing, a lot better. I've been through phases in my career as an athlete when I was not comfortable running more often than once every other day. But that was not nearly enough total exercise for me to achieve the goals I wanted to achieve. Like I'm a twice a day exerciser most days. So I once trained for a 50-mile ultra marathon, only running 3 to 4 times per week. But literally 2/3 of my training was non-impact cardiovascular cross training. And it was clear just from running that, and there's science to back it up, but just from running that experiment on myself, it was clear that I was not giving up much at all. Yes, I might have performed 2% better if I'd been able to run more. but I wouldn't have actually, because I would have gotten injured. So by relying on cross training, I avoided injury. And so I think the bare minimum, if you want to improve as a runner, you need to run 3 times per week minimum. More is better, but there's so many runners who just they don't believe cross training could possibly work. I promise you, it does. So it's out there as an option. It doesn't have to be run or rest. It can be run or cross train or rest.
And I think that's a great option for runners. Like you mentioned the elliptical, you mentioned some cycling, and then there's also like Ultra G, pool running, a whole other set of options out there, as well as strength training. We'll just throw my 2 cents in and say runners should be strength training. There's a lot of different episodes on the podcast that talk that up. I think we spoke about that last time, Matt. And then once we've got that cross training in there, or if we don't, we need to find that dosage that works best for us, depending on whether we're maybe that more injury prone runner or not. So we'd be amiss not to mention the triathletes around and Matt's new book, 80-20 Triathlon. So I'm guessing we found that the 80-20 rule is not exclusive to running, and it holds across a lot of endurance sports. Are there any key distinctions we need to make for the triathletes?
Yeah, so that's what's so interesting about this 80-20 rule is that endurance is endurance. Whether you're rowing or running, if your race is more than 40 seconds long, the underlying physiology for success is pretty much the same. Like you need the same kind of fitness. So it's no surprise to find that elite athletes, across endurance disciplines are training pretty much the same way when you look at intensity distribution. And then the research on everyday athletes in these sports where, they'll take a group of club level runners or whatever and separate them into 2 groups and have half of them do 80-20 and the other half do 50-50. It's no surprise that across disciplines, the 80-20 athletes, even if they're, just genetically average and not training nearly as much as the elites do, they benefit most from 80-20. But there's also specificity, like, take professional cyclists. They ride their bike once a day, right? Well, professional swimmers swim twice a day. Professional runners run twice a day. Swimmers are very, very technique focused. So they'll do a ton of work on honing their technique. Runners and cyclists, not so much, right? So there are differences sort of on the more superficial level. Like on intensity distribution, it's the same. But on other levels, you need to treat each specific endurance discipline as a thing unto itself. So with triathlon, you're combining 3 similar but distinct endurance disciplines. So so the 80-20 rule still applies, but there was a justification for a separate book, right? Because you apply that rule in a somewhat different way because it is a different sport.
Yeah. So just on the swimmers, like, what are your thoughts on getting our swimmers to swim at more low intensity?
Yeah, swimming. You referred earlier to that there's sort of a laundry list of reasons that athletes will get caught in the moderate intensity rut or not do enough low intensity. With swimming, one of the reasons that's unique to that sport is that it's just really boring to swim slow laps. You know what I mean? It's just like I'm this way myself. When I go to the pool to do like an endurance swim, it's just like back and forth, nice and easy. It just the time ticks by so slowly. But when I break up a swim into high intensity intervals, it's more engaging, the time passes much more quickly. And so that's a big thing for swimmers because it's just, it's 25 meters or whatever it is. But it's just, you have to keep your eyes on the prize. Like, do what works, like if you care, like if you only care so much and you'd rather just go do intervals all the time, fine. But for me, like, I want to get the most possible benefit out of whatever amount of time I can allocate to these sports. And so sometimes that means having, maybe a little bit less fun, but actually getting more benefit from what you're doing. So just, have a plan and execute it.
I mean, I guess the fortunate thing about swimming, as you mentioned, is because it does require so much technique, that low intensity favors well the development of technique, because you can concentrate on your technique whilst taking it quite easy. And that's also, as you mentioned, 80-20 running, not just unique to swimming, but that low intensity tends itself well to developing like the natural skill and technique, even if we don't think of that so much as runners.
Yeah, that's a great point. It applies in somewhat different ways, because in swimming, drills should be, especially if you're not a less experienced swimmer, they should be a chunk of each workout. And when you're doing a drill, like a technique drill, it's not even really swimming. It could just be, pulling without kicking, or kicking without pulling, or swimming on your side, or whatever. You don't even care about intensity at that point. So it might as well be low, right? If you're trying to get your brain to remember better patterns, why make it more stressful by making it high intensity? You're going to get a fitness benefit just because you're moving. And with running, one of the underappreciated mechanisms for improved running efficiency is repetition. That's actually the main way you become a more efficient runner, is just by taking step after step after step. Well, you take a lot more steps at low intensity than you do at high intensity. So even if you're out there just cruising, you might not even really think you're getting much out of it from a technique perspective, but you absolutely are if you're either running far or, doing a high volume at that low intensity.
Runners don't often think too much about technique and that skill side of things. Some of us, of course, do running drills, and they have a role there as well. But that low intensity does lend itself well to developing, your skill. And you mentioned in 80-20 running as well that we want that endurance in your natural stride. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for listeners?
Running is not that different from walking, where, unless you have some kind of disability, it's something that everyone can do. You're walking when you're a year old, and you're running, by the time you're 3 at the latest. And so it's a little different from something like swimming or riding a bike, which are not natural human activities. And what's really interesting, and, there are coaches out there who are technique coaches, right? And they'll say, okay, here's the right way to run. And then I coach athletes to all run that same way. But what the research shows is that when you force an athlete to run like someone else, to copy, there's a better runner, run like that person, you actually become less efficient. And if you actually just run without thinking about your stride, you become more efficient. It's what's known in science as a self-optimizing system. It's not that different from the evolutionary process and training that we were alluded to earlier, where it's sort of a trial and error process. Every time you go out for a run, your brain is talking to your muscles, and your muscles are talking to your brain. And it happens at an almost entirely subconscious level, but you're becoming more efficient. Your neuromuscular system is finding shortcuts, and you actually override that natural process by trying to make it conscious. It's I need to move my arms like this. I need to put my feet down like this. Now, altering your stride can be essential if you are getting injured. And because a lot of injuries do result from, what I'll call abnormalities in your stride technique. I've had to adjust my own stride to avoid injury, but you should never adjust your stride to become more efficient, because the science absolutely could not be clearer. It doesn't work. In fact, it backfires. If you want to become more efficient as a runner, run.
On this interest edition, you're listening to best-selling author Matt Fitzgerald sharing around the key principle of running, training, and endurance training known as 80-20 running. If you missed last week's episode featuring Irish running great Sonia O'Sullivan, 5,000 metre world champion and silver 5,000 metre Olympic medalist, sharing around her highs, lows and learnings, then here's a little snippet of what you missed.
I think a great coach will listen to the athlete and not just stand there and give out orders and instructions. And a great coach can communicate with the athletes, on the athlete's level, not just on, I'm in charge level.
To tune into the full episode featuring Sonia O'Sullivan, be sure to jump back and download the episode from your favourite podcast player. And while there, why don't you peruse the archives dating right back to episode 1 featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest and interest edition best-selling author Matt Fitzgerald on all things 80-20 running. Why runners need to go slow to go faster.
So with all this stuff on 80-20, I guess a lot of people either don't know that they're doing this and therefore they haven't done it, but there are also some other barriers. Are there any that you find the athletes that you coach face on adopting and implementing this?
Buy-in is one of them. Like actually believing that it's true is a big one because it is counterintuitive. How do I get faster by running slower, right? So that's a tough one to overcome. Yeah. But that's why, in my books, I try to make the most persuasive case I possibly can. Yeah. Just like take a leap of faith and try it. I promise it'll work. But, that's one. Another one is what I loosely call the Strava Effect, which is like we all have egos or pride, and we don't want to be the slowest one. If you bicycle in a group, you'll tend to be pulled along by the faster riders because you don't want to be left behind. If you are a Strava person and you're sharing your workout details, like you want to have the fastest segment or at least not the slowest segment, right? Or if you swim in a pool in a masters group, you don't want to be in the slowest lane. All of these sort of social or peer pressure factors can push us into the moderate intensity rut. Intensity blindness, you mentioned at the beginning of the interview. That's just simply not knowing what low intensity actually is. The example I always give is if I take the average runner and say, go run for 40 minutes at low intensity, that runner will go out, run for 40 minutes at moderate intensity, and then come back and say, hey, coach, I did exactly what you said, because they simply don't know. There's a host of them. So, it really does require a very intentional approach. Just, hoping for the best, saying, oh, that 80-20 thing sounds great. Like you're not actually going to do it unless you do the testing, find your zones, and then, have an 80-20 plan and then monitor what you're doing as you go each day.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that it does require a little bit of planning and it does require a little bit of math. And I can attest to just getting something like either a plan from, I think you believe that you do plans as well, Matt, but even I've had experience with runners just doing a simple Excel spreadsheet where they can drop things in there, and once you set it up, it does all the math for you. So, don't be overwhelmed by the math of it or the planning of it. It can be really quite simple once you set it up. And I guess speaking on the math, like you mentioned that in the book that, it's based around time as well. That's often a thing that people get confused about, the 80%
Yep.
to 20%, and that we're talking in chunks of time and not distance or mileage.
Running time and running distance obviously are closely connected. Generally speaking, the more time you run, the more distance you'll cover. But at higher intensities, you do cover more distance in less time. It is important actually to be clear what we're talking about. Like, is the 80-20 rule based on time, or distance. And it is, in fact, based on time. That's actually partly what makes it universal across endurance sports, because your body doesn't operate in terms of distance. It operates in terms of time. Like, it's duration of exposure to a stimulus that determines its effect. So yeah, that's important to be clear about. Like, you can do your planning in distance if you so choose, but you have to understand the mathematical relationship between distance and time. It's funny you bring that up, because in 80-20 triathlon, we prescribe our running and cycling workouts mostly in time, but our swim workouts are prescribed in distance. And the reason is because nearly all swimmers and triathletes do nearly all of their swimming in pools. And it's really hard to do time-based sessions in a pool. I mean, think about it. If I say, all right, I want you to do, 5 times 3 minutes in zone 4, chances are when you finish those 3-minute intervals, you're going to be in the middle of the pool, right? And also, it's really hard to check your watch without breaking up your stroke. So how do you check it? Like, it's just much more practical to do distance-based workouts. So for our swim workouts, it's actually a 75-25 rule. Again, because you tend to cover more distance in less time at higher intensities, it's a slightly different ratio that gets you to the same effect.
Yeah, we don't want to cut ourselves short on any runs either. When we're short on time, I think most triathletes, especially runners as well, are time crunched, and that 20k run can easily turn into 15 if we lose time and don't plan accordingly. So it's often easier as well to plan based on time. Yeah,
yeah, that's true.
And you mentioned that, I think, in 80-20 triathlon. So as we kind of bring this towards the close, Matt, any first steps? I think we kind of already touched on it, but any next steps that you think the listeners should take in terms of their movement towards a sort of 80-20 approach? Yeah,
one thing I like to stress is that, as much as we've been talking about math, like, don't get too caught up in the numbers. Like, if you can take away only one thing from, our conversation, it's that you should be at a low intensity when you mean to be at a low intensity. That is really the essence of the mistake that athletes are making. There's no magic in round numbers, but most of us are way off of where we should be. And the main reason is, when we think we're at low intensity, we're actually not. So, math aside, that's really the problem you want to solve. Like, there's a place for high intensity, it's like, it's wonderful stuff, but when you want to be low, you need to be low.
And even if you're not monitoring heart rate or pace or perceived exertion, we can always use the talk test as well. There's no math involved in that for runners.
Well said.
So, Matt, I believe if listeners are looking for more information on 80-20 running or triathlon, which is your new book, you also have like training plans as well online. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep. And
can you just direct listeners as to where potentially to go to look for that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so I have a website, 8020endurance.com, kind of a clearinghouse for all things 80-20. And then my personal website is mattfitzgerald.org.
Awesome. And thanks again for coming on the podcast, Matt. There's a lot of gems in there for listeners, both runners and triathletes alike. So thanks again, Matt. And I look forward to speaking again shortly, mate.
My pleasure.
So there you have it. Another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I trust you enjoyed this episode and interest edition. If you did, then please let Lewis, myself, and Matt Fitzgerald know. You can easily find Matt over on Twitter at MattFitWriter, MattFitWriter. You'll find myself at Brad_Beer over on Instagram, and today's host, Lewis Craig, _Lewis Craig, one word, _ over on Twitter. Don't forget, the Physical Performance Show also has its own handle now on Instagram at Physical Performance Show. So we'd love to hear what it was that you enjoyed or learnt from today's episode. A big thanks to the good folk who make this show possible week in, week out. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things administration, and Matthew Walding on all things graphic design. A huge, huge thank you to you, the faithful show supporter, for your attention and also for sharing the episodes that you find helpful or enjoyable with your friends who I'm sure, just like you, are looking to pursue and perform at their own physical best. One of the best ways you can help the Physical Performance Show grow is through ratings, reviews, and subscribing to the show over on iTunes. A big thanks this week to show supporter Bamback. Bamback rated the show 5 stars and commented, "Have recently discovered this podcast and have since purchased You Can Run pain-free. Episodes are always full of up-to-date information, excellent sound quality, and rich in practicality. Thank you for sharing." Bamback, thank you for taking the time to leave a review. Huge thanks to today's show supporter, Sanitarium PB. I often say podcasts are free to download, however, they are not free to produce. So Sanitarium PB, thank you once again for your support. Don't forget to check out the great product at your local fuel station. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, I bring you a conversation that I had recently with US 800-meter track star Nick Simmons. Nick Simmons is quite the character in the world of athletics. He's a dual American Olympian, and part of his sporting pedigree is he made every national US team that he ever trialed for. Nick is the CEO of American nutritional company Run Gum, and you'll really enjoy Nick's sharings next week as he shares around his highs, lows, and learnings from his incredible career. So until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.